All right, so buckle up because today we are diving deep into the heart of a conservative White House.
Sounds exciting.
It is. We're going behind the scenes with Mandate for Leadership, cracking open Chapter 1, all about the White House office.
Oh, that's a good one.
It is. Ever wonder how a conservative administration actually operates? Well, get ready to find out
I'm ready.
because we're about to unpack a treasure chest of insights.
Let's do it.
All right. So first things first, what makes a conservative approach to the presidency unique?
Well, one thing Dearborn really hits on is that it's not enough for a president to just want to change the country.
Right, they've got to actually do it the right way.
Exactly. He's really big on working within the Constitution, finding that balance.
Between ambition and sticking to those founding principles.
Exactly. It's about having big goals, but achieving them the right way constitutionally.
It's like that saying, you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs, but you also don't want to end up with eggshells all over the place, right?
That's a great way to put it. And Dearborn actually offers some pretty concrete advice on how a conservative president can strike that balance.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What's the secret sauce?
It's all about surrounding yourself with the right people. Not just yes men, but folks who are deeply committed to upholding the Constitution, even when it's tough.
Ah, so it's about building a team where everyone gets the why behind the what, not just following orders blindly.
Exactly. It's like having a team of experts who are also guardians of those founding principles. They're not afraid to speak up and say, hold on, are we staying true to our values here?
I see. So it's about checks and balances, even within the administration itself.
Precisely. And speaking of checks and balances, Dearborn actually gives this fascinating historical overview of how the White House office itself has evolved.
Oh, I love the history stuff.
Me too. Did you know that what we think of as the White House office started as just a small team advising George Washington?
Wow, really? From a tiny team to this, massive machine we see today.
I know, right? It's incredible to see how much the demands of the presidency have grown over time.
It's like comparing a horse and buggy to a spaceship. They both get you where you need to go, but the technology and complexity are on a whole other level now.
That's such a good analogy. And because of that complexity, you need a well-defined system,
Right.
which is where Dearborn's breakdown of these key roles within the White House becomes so important.
It's like you've got this massive play with a huge cast of characters. You need to know who the main players are
Right.
and how their roles all fit together.
Exactly. And when it comes to the White House, who's the conductor of that orchestra?
Well, it has to be the chief of staff, right? Often
Mhm.
called the second most powerful person in Washington.
Exactly. And Dearborn doesn't disappoint. He gives some really great insights into how crucial that role really is.
So spill the tea. What makes a good chief of staff in a conservative White House?
Well, Dearborn really emphasizes that the chief of staff is like the conductor of an orchestra, making sure everyone's on the same page.
And that the music flows smoothly, in this case, the music being the president's agenda.
Exactly. But it's more than just keeping things running day to day. They're also thinking about the long game.
Right, so they need that strategic vision, too.
Absolutely. They're the ones who decide who gets access to the president, which issues take priority, and essentially how the entire White House functions. Talk about pressure.
It's like they are the ultimate gatekeeper, shaping the president's world and making sure things stay on track.
You got it. And, this all ties back to that saying, personnel is policy.
Oh, I like that one.
Right. The people a president chooses for their inner circle, especially the chief of staff, it really does shape their entire administration.
Absolutely. But even the best conductor needs a talented orchestra, right?
Exactly. And that brings us to the deputy chiefs of staff.
Ah, the essential supporting cast, crucial for the plot, but maybe not always in the spotlight.
I like that analogy. And just like in a good story, you often have different types of deputies, each with their own strengths. Dearborn points out that some are masters of operations.
The ones who make sure the trains run on time, even if it's all happening behind the scenes.
You got it.
Yeah.
Scheduling, logistics, security, all the details that most people never even think about.
But without those details, the whole thing falls apart.
Exactly. But then you've got other deputy chiefs of staff who are all about the policy.
Ah, so you've got the doers and the thinkers.
I like that.
Okay.
And you need both to make a successful White House run.
Okay, so we've got the chief of staff calling the shots, the deputies keeping everything running smoothly. Who else is in this inner circle of power?
Well, Dearborn says you can't forget about the senior advisors.
Ah, those are the people who really have the president's ear, right?
Exactly. Often, they've known the president for years, maybe even decades. Their advice carries a lot of weight.
It's like having a trusted friend who also happens to be a political mastermind.
That's a great way to put it. They offer support, but they're also not afraid to challenge the president's thinking. And they're thinking about the big picture, the long game.
So it's not just about policy details. It's about strategy, messaging, even anticipating potential political landmines.
Precisely. They're like the president's personal sounding board.
It makes you wonder what those conversations must be like. Okay, so we've got the strategists, the organizers, the trusted confidants. Who else is essential in this White House lineup?
Well, imagine you're building a house. You've got all these skilled people, architects, contractors, designers,
Right.
but you also need someone to make sure the foundation is solid.
Otherwise, the whole thing could come crashing down. So who plays that role in the White House?
That's where the White House Counsel comes in. And Dearborn is very clear. This isn't just any lawyer.
Oh, what makes them different?
Well, he actually describes them as more of an activist plaintiff's firm.
Wow, that's a very specific and interesting comparison. What does he mean by that?
It means they're not just sitting there waiting for legal questions to come to them. They're actively looking for ways to advance the president's agenda, but always within the bounds of the law.
So they need to be creative thinkers, problem solvers.
Exactly. It's not just about saying no. It's about finding a way to say yes while still upholding the Constitution and the rule of law.
It sounds like a high wire act, balancing those competing demands. So we've met the key players, the inner circle, but what about the actual machinery of government, the offices and agencies that make it all happen?
Well, that's where things get really interesting.
Because we're just getting started. So we've met the A-team inside a conservative White House. But what about the tools they use to get things done?
Yes. The machinery of a government itself.
Because it's one thing to have a vision, but putting it into action, that's a whole other ballgame.
It absolutely is. And that's where these offices Dearborn talks about come in. They're the engines that drive a conservative agenda forward.
I like that engines, because it really is like a well-oiled machine, right?
Exactly. Dearborn emphasizes that it's not enough to just have brilliant people at the top. You need a system that can translate those ideas into action.
Okay, so where do we even begin? There's so many moving parts.
Well, one of the most powerful tools in any administration's arsenal is communication.
Right, because perception is reality, right?
Exactly. And that's where the Office of Communications comes in. They're the ones shaping the message, framing the narrative for the American people.
So how does a conservative approach to communications differ from, say, a liberal one?
That's a great question. Dearborn really stresses the importance of a unified message. He suggests that a conservative White House would prioritize clarity and consistency, avoiding any mixed messages that could muddy the waters.
So less improvisation, more carefully crafted talking points.
You could say that. It's about controlling the message, making sure everyone's on the same page, and presenting a united front to the public.
Makes sense, especially in today's world with social media and 247 news cycles. It's easy to get drowned out in all the noise.
Exactly. And Dearborn doesn't shy away from the tough questions either. He even suggests that a conservative president might want to rethink the whole White House Correspondents' Dinner thing.
Oh, really? That's interesting. What's his take on that?
Well, he seems to think that it's become too cozy, too much of an insider game. He argues that a conservative president should be more strategic about media engagement, maybe even look for alternative ways to connect with the American people directly.
So less schmoozing with reporters, more direct engagement with the public.
You got it.
Yeah.
Using social media, town halls, maybe even going around the traditional media altogether to get their message out there.
Interesting strategy. It's like going straight to the source, cutting out the middleman. Okay, so we've got the messaging down. But what about actually getting things done in Washington?
Yes. That's where the Office of Legislative Affairs comes in, or OLA for short.
The bridge between the White House and Capitol Hill.
Exactly. It doesn't matter how brilliant the president's ideas are if they can't get them through Congress.
Right, you need the votes.
Precisely. And that's what the OLA is all about, building relationships with congressional leaders, negotiating compromises, and ultimately getting those bills passed.
It's like they're playing 3D chess while everyone else is playing checkers.
That's a good way to put it. It requires a deep understanding of the legislative process, strong negotiation skills, and a knack for finding common ground, even when it seems impossible.
So they're like the ultimate deal makers.
Exactly. They're the ones working behind the scenes to turn the president's vision into a legislative reality.
I'm starting to realize that there's a lot more to governing than meets the eye. It's not just about giving speeches and signing bills.
Not at all. It's about building consensus, navigating complex relationships, and understanding the levers of power.
Speaking of levers of power, Dearborn also spends quite a bit of time on the Office of Presidential Personnel, or PPO. What makes this office so crucial?
Well, it all comes back to that saying we talked about earlier, personnel is policy.
Right, the people you surround yourself with.
They matter. The PPO is responsible for finding and vetting candidates for thousands of positions across the executive branch. And we're not just talking about entry-level positions here. We're talking about ambassadors, judges, cabinet secretaries, the people who really shape how the government functions.
So it's about finding people who are not only qualified, but who also share the president's conservative vision.
Exactly. It's about building a team that's both competent and ideologically aligned with the president's agenda. Because if you don't have the right people in the right places, even the best policies in the world can fall flat.
It's like that saying, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link.
Precisely. And the PPO is there to make sure there are no weak links, at least not if they can help it.
Okay, so we've got the message, the legislative strategy, the right people in place. What else is there?
Well, it's not enough to just focus on the internal workings of government. You also need to connect with the American people, build support for the president's agenda.
Right, because governing isn't just about what happens inside the Beltway. It's about connecting with real people and addressing their concerns.
Exactly. And that's where the Office of Public Liaison comes in. They're the ones responsible for reaching out to all those different groups out there, business leaders, faith-based organizations, community activists, you name it.
So it's about building bridges, creating dialogue, making sure those diverse voices are heard.
Precisely. They're like the eyes and ears of the White House, keeping their fingers on the pulse of the American people.
It sounds like they need to be master communicators, able to explain complex policies in a way that resonates with everyday folks.
Absolutely. It's about connecting the dots between the president's vision and the real-world impact it has on people's lives.
Making it personal, relatable.
Exactly. Because at the end of the day, it's about people.
Okay, so we've got public engagement covered, but what about the other levels of government? States, cities, tribal governments, they play a role too, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And Dearborn doesn't forget about them. That's where the Office of Intergovernmental Affairs comes in the IGA.
So they're like the diplomats of the federal government, building relationships with governors, mayors, tribal leaders.
Exactly. Because even with a strong vision from the top, you need buy-in and collaboration from those on the ground to actually make things happen.
It's about recognizing that governing is a team sport, and everyone needs to be working together.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
Now, before we move on to those policy powerhouses, I'm curious about something.
Shoot.
Dearborn talks about the vice president and the first spouse. What's their role in all of this?
It's interesting you bring that up because they're not exactly part of the formal policy-making structure, but they clearly have a lot of influence.
Exactly. So how does Dearborn see their roles in a conservative White House?
Well, he points out that the vice president has really become a much more central player in recent administrations. They often take on specific policy initiatives or act as a key advisor to the president.
It's like having a built-in partner in command, someone you trust to handle those high-profile projects or sensitive diplomatic missions.
Exactly. And then there's the first spouse.
Ah, yes. A unique and often underestimated role.
Right. Because while they're not directly involved in policy making, they often use their platform to champion specific causes or bring attention to issues that are important to them.
It's a less overtly political role, but that doesn't make it any less impactful.
Exactly. They can often connect with people on a more personal level, addressing sensitive social issues in a way that a president simply can't.
They humanize the administration.
Exactly. Okay, so we've covered a ton of ground here. Crafting the message, working with Congress, engaging the public, even the unique roles of the vice president and first spouse. But what about the actual policies themselves? Where do those come from and how do they become a reality?
Ah, well, that's where things get really interesting. Because now we're entering the world of policy councils, the engines that drive a conservative agenda forward. But that, my friend, is a story for another time.
All right, let's fire up those engines and get into these policy councils.
You bet. This is where the rubber meets the road.
It is. We've talked about the people, the process, the messaging, but this is where it all comes together.
Exactly, where ideas become action. And Dearborn, he really gets into the weeds here. He calls these councils the engines of policy development.
Engines. I like that.
Yeah.
Powerful. So give us the rundown. What are we talking about here?
Well, Dearborn, he focuses on three main ones: the National Security Council, the NEC, which is the National Economic Council, and then you've got the Domestic Policy Council.
Okay, so big picture stuff. National security, the economy, domestic issues.
Exactly. But what's interesting is that they all follow this similar structure. He calls it a tiered interagency process.
Tiered interagency process sounds complicated.
Actually, it's not as bad as it sounds. Think of it like a pyramid.
Okay, picturing it.
So you've got the base of the pyramid. Dearborn calls this the Policy Coordinating Committee.
Catchy name.
Right. But basically, this is where you have experts from all the different government agencies coming together.
So, like, if we're talking about trade policy.
Exactly. You'd have folks from Commerce, Treasury, maybe even State, all at the table.
Hashing it out.
Exactly. Trying to find some common ground, develop some policy options.
Okay, but I imagine those conversations can get pretty heated, with everyone representing their own agency's interests.
Oh, absolutely. And that's where the next tier of the pyramid comes in.
Okay, what do we have here?
The Deputies Committee.
So, if those first guys can't agree.
They bring in the big guns. The Deputies Committee, these are the higher-ups within each agency, people who have the authority to actually make decisions.
And if they still can't come to a consensus.
And it goes up one more level to the Principals Committee.
All right, so now we're talking cabinet secretaries.
Exactly. This is where the real power players come in.
So what happens if they hit a brick wall? Who breaks the tie?
Well, there's only one person left at that point.
The president?
Exactly. The buck stops there. So they get all the recommendations, all the different viewpoints, and then it's up to them to make the final call.
So it's like a system designed to make sure all the voices are heard, but ultimately someone has to be the decider.
Exactly. And it really highlights something Dearborn talks about a lot, the importance of a strong executive branch. Someone who can make tough choices.
Okay, so that's the structure, but let's get specific. What are these councils actually doing? Let's start with the National Security Council, the NSC.
All right. So the NSC, this is the big one for anything related to, well, national security and foreign policy. It's actually written into law, so it's a little more formal than some of the other councils.
Okay, so who are we talking about here? Who's on the NSC?
Well, you've got your statutory members, the president, VP, Secretary of State, Defense, Energy, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the director of national intelligence. Big players.
And then there's the National Security Advisor.
Ah, yes. The National Security Advisor, they're essentially the quarterback of the NSC.
So they're coordinating policy development, advising the president on all things national security, high-pressure job.
You can say that again.
Yeah.
Especially during a crisis. That's when the National Security Advisor, they really have to be on their game.
Okay, so that's national security. What about keeping the U.S. economy strong? That's where the NEC comes in, right?
Right. The National Economic Council, their job is to make sure the economy is humming along, that we're competitive globally, that kind of thing.
So what are some of the issues they might be tackling?
Oh, it could be anything. Job growth, wages, trade deals, the deficit, you name it. The NEC director, they have to be a jack of all trades when it comes to economics.
Sounds like it. All right, and finally, we've got the Domestic Policy Council, the DPC. What falls under their umbrella?
Everything else, well, not everything, but anything domestic that's not national security or the economy. So education, healthcare, immigration, it's a long list.
Sounds like it. So the DPC director, they must need to be incredibly versatile.
Oh, absolutely. Able to switch gears quickly. 1 minute it's education reform, the next minute it's environmental policy. It's a challenging job, for sure.
It's amazing to get this peek behind the curtain and see how much goes on to shape these policies that impact our lives.
I know, right? It's complex, for sure. But I think Dearborn does a great job of showing us that it's not just about these processes, these structures. It's about people.
It is. Making decisions, often under a lot of pressure.
Exactly. Trying to do what's best for the country, but also trying to stay true to their own values, their own vision.
And that's what makes it so fascinating, right? Because there's no easy answers. It's all about navigating that tension between pragmatism and principle.
You said it. It's about finding a way to get things done while staying true to those core beliefs. And that's something that every president grapples with.
Absolutely. And it's something for all of us to think about as we watch these policies play out on the world stage. Well, we've done it again, folks. Another deep dive, another treasure trove of insights. From the Oval Office to the policy trenches, we've explored the inner workings of a conservative White House, and I hope you've learned as much as I have. Until next time, keep asking those tough questions, keep seeking out diverse perspectives, and most importantly, never stop exploring the fascinating world of American politics.